Okay, let's unpack this. It's a rare moment, isn't it? Seeing such widespread unease globally.
It really is.
But these recent U.S. tariff policies, they seem to have done it. Markets are twitchy, voters seem unsure.
Allies are definitely concerned, yeah. And even countries we don't exactly see eye to eye with are scratching their heads.
So what's really going on here?
I think it's the sheer intensity of the reaction, and how broad it is. It suggests we might be seeing a real break from, well, from the way things used to work economically.
Exactly. And that's what we're diving into today. We're looking at some really sharp analysis from a recent interview with Ian Bremmer.
Ah, the political scientist, founder of Eurasia Group, right?
That's him. His approach is known for being pretty analytical, nonpartisan, just what we need to cut through all the noise, really.
Yeah, his value is looking beyond the sort of daily ups and downs, isn't it? Seeing the bigger shifts, the potential long-term fallout from these policies.
Right. So our mission here is to pull out the most critical insights from Bremer's take, give everyone a clearer picture of the geopolitical landscape, how U.S. policy is shaping it.
Mm-hmm.
We'll get into some surprising stuff, the global economy, alliances, even how figures like Elon Musk fit into all this, trying to make sense of it without the usual news cycle overload.
Just the core analysis. Got it.
So let's start with these tariffs. Bremer described the reaction as, well, universally negative.
He did, and he emphasized how broad that negativity is. You've got financial markets showing uncertainty, American voters aren't exactly cheering,
Right.
our allies are definitely voicing concern, and even, adversaries are objecting. It's a strange kind of global agreement.
And it's not just the feeling, it's the scale.
Yeah.
Bremer pointed out global tariff levels are the highest since the 1930s.
That's a huge historical flag right there.
It really is. It kind of suggests a major reversal, doesn't it? Decades of moving towards liberalization, and now this. A potential shift in how the U.S. sees its global economic role.
A stark comparison, definitely. And it's made worse by the sheer unpredictability.
How so?
Well, the constant changes. Percentages go up, then down, exceptions appear and disappear, talk of embargoes one minute, potential deals the next.
Right, it's whiplash.
Exactly. It creates this climate where, long-term planning becomes almost impossible. For businesses, for other countries.
It's tough to build a strategy on shifting sands. Bremer talked about short-term chaos versus something potentially deeper, didn't he? Long-term fragmentation.
Yes, and that's a crucial point. Is this just temporary disruption to get a better deal, or is it something more fundamental?
And Bremer leans towards.
He suggests the sustained uncertainty risks fragmenting the global economy itself. Nations start losing confidence in the U.S. being a consistent, reliable partner.
So they start looking elsewhere.
Yeah.
De-risking.
Precisely. This de-risking isn't just about immediate economics, it's a loss of trust in the long-term stability of the U.S. relationship.
So not just a bumpy period, but potentially the start of the global economy kind of unraveling, at least the interconnectedness we've known.
That's the risk he highlights. And alongside that economic fragmentation, he talks about the erosion of U.S. reputational capital.
Meaning our standing in the world, our trustworthiness.
Exactly. If countries feel they can't rely on the U.S. sticking to deals or maintaining predictable policies, they'll naturally build stronger ties elsewhere.
And we're already seeing examples of this de-risking he mentioned, countries actively trying to rely less on the U.S.
Oh, absolutely. He gave several examples. China strengthening ties in Southeast Asia, Canada and Europe getting closer, Brazil looking more towards Europe, India engaging more with the U.K., Australia and New Zealand deepening their ties.
So a lot of hedging going on. A reevaluation of the U.S. as that reliable, long-term partner.
It certainly looks that way based on his analysis.
Now, it wasn't all doom and gloom. Bremer did mention some countries seem willing or maybe eager to make deals with the U.S.
That's true. It's not uniform. He pointed to Japan, for instance, offering to buy more U.S. LNG, boost investments, maybe play with the yen exchange rate.
Okay.
South Korea was another one he mentioned as being open to deals. And Mexico, where you have a popular leader who's actively working with the U.S. on things like fentanyl and immigration.
So bilateral deals might still be possible, but Bremer seemed, let's say, less optimistic about the EU.
Well, yeah, the dynamic there is just fundamentally different, isn't it? You're not dealing with one country.
27 member states.
Right. Plus a big bureaucracy, and trade is like a core competency for the EU as a whole. It's much harder to get quick, sweeping deals done compared to negotiating one-on-one.
Makes sense. And then there's China. Bremer essentially described the situation as a trade war.
Pretty much.
And he thinks this trend of decoupling, reducing that economic interdependence is likely to continue even if the U.S. dialed back some tariffs.
His analysis suggests there's now a fundamental strategic mistrust from Beijing's perspective, a feeling that the U.S. wants to hinder China's rise.
Regardless of specific tariff levels.
Exactly. That underlying suspicion is likely to keep pushing the two economies apart, which has huge global consequences. We've already seen hints of how China might retaliate things like Boeing orders or critical minerals.
Right. Bremer made a really crucial point here, I thought. He said a complete end to globalization probably isn't happening.
Unlikely, yeah.
But just going back to the way things were before the tariffs, with the U.S. maybe even stronger.
Yeah.
That's also unrealistic. The ground has shifted.
That's a key takeaway. The actions taken have had lasting effects on trust, on relationships. You can't just rewind the clock.
And the issues Bremer raised went beyond just trade disputes, didn't they?
They did. He touched on other actions, particularly under the previous administration, that caused friction.
Yeah, this was interesting. He brought up the treatment of, tourists and students, and he even suggested the U.S. was undermining its own rule of law at home.
Which matters because of the perception it creates for allies. If they see the U.S. weakening its own legal standards or treating citizens of friendly nations poorly.
It chips away at that foundation of trust and shared values, that reputational capital you mentioned.
Exactly.
Let's focus on China again for a second. Bremer seemed to agree with the idea of decoupling, at least in critical areas, like semiconductors in Taiwan.
Yeah, he was quite blunt about that, calling the previous reliance on a potential adversary for such a vital tech component stupid from a strategic view.
He compared it to Germany relying on Russian energy.
Right, highlighting that strategic vulnerability.
But then he posed a really sharp question. If decoupling from China is strategically necessary, why are we also picking fights with our allies at the same time?
Seems counterproductive, doesn't it?
Totally. And this gets into the motivations behind that previous foreign policy approach. What did Bremer suggest was driving it?
A mix of things, according to his analysis. A strong self-belief, perhaps a lack of patience or deep policy expertise. A real conviction that other countries were ripping off the U.S., and maybe a feeling that urgent, decisive action was needed.
And the potential consequence of that approach. Bremer hinted at U.S. isolation.
Yeah, the risk that the U.S. ends up more isolated and our allies are left trying to figure out how to compete with China, possibly without strong U.S. leadership or even coordination.
Which contrasts with something like the CHIPS Act under the current administration, right? Which Bremer saw as more aligned with actually outcompeting China long term.
Exactly. He saw the CHIPS Act as a more coherent strategic investment approach. And he noted the potential irony if such initiatives were dismantled purely for political reasons.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Bremer had this striking observation about the U.S. being the most coin-operated advanced democracy.
Yeah, that was a strong statement. But he also stressed this isn't new. It's a long-standing issue, not something that just popped up with one administration.
What's interesting is he thinks many Americans agree this system isn't working right, that money has too much influence. The disagreement is on why.
Right. He sort of described a two-tiered system almost, where access to power, how laws get applied, can depend a lot on financial resources.
He gave specific examples of money-shaping policy, too, didn't he? TikTok, crypto.
Oil and gas, big pharma, retail, even trial lawyers. It paints a picture of pretty extensive influence across the board, regardless of who's in power.
And that led into the discussion about wealthy individuals having outsized political influence. Elon Musk came up specifically.
Right. Bremer raised some concerns there about potential conflicts of interest.
Which sparked a bit of debate. There's this tension, isn't there, between bringing in successful business minds to make government more effective.
Versus the risk that their private interests could clash with the public good, or that they might bypass established rules and norms.
The interviewer seemed more positive, seeing the upside of that business efficiency applied to government.
True. But Bremer pointed to specific things with Musk that worried him, like his interactions with certain European political groups or meetings with foreign leaders that seemed maybe unofficial.
Yeah, the potential impact on alliances if influential figures align with controversial foreign parties.
And the lack of transparency around some meetings. Bremer wasn't necessarily saying it's about direct financial gain for someone like Musk, but more about the principle, the need to consistently apply rules and norms, maintain transparency, avoid those conflicts of interest.
Okay. Moving on to another huge topic, artificial intelligence. Both Bremer and the interviewer seem to agree AI is going to be massively transformative and soon, like within 5 years.
Yeah, the speed and scale are the key things they highlighted. Fundamental changes coming to geopolitics, the economy, society, everything.
Bremer even talked about significant white-collar job displacement. He used banking risk management as an example.
Right, just one illustration of how AI could disrupt many industries, not just blue-collar work.
But maybe the most radical idea was the rise of individual AI agents, how that changes our interaction with technology itself.
That's a huge shift he described. Instead of us using apps, we'll have AI acting for us. It could become, our most critical relationship, offering incredible capabilities, access to knowledge.
Sounds amazing, but also potentially really divisive. Bremer worried about a growing gap, didn't he? Between the AI haves and have-nots.
He did. He worried it could lead to a kind of dehumanization for those left behind, those without access to these powerful AI agents.
And that accessibility gap seemed to worry him more than, say, people resisting AI.
Yeah, his bigger fear was this scenario where a huge chunk of the world just can't afford or access advanced AI, leading to massive inequality and maybe losing status in an AI-driven world.
Okay, let's turn to some specific conflicts. Russia-Ukraine. How did Bremer characterize Trump's approach?
Kind of a carrot and stick approach, but interestingly, he felt the stick was mostly aimed at Ukraine, while the carrots were offered more towards Russia.
And did you think that was effective, in a way?
He suggested, maybe surprisingly, that suspending U.S. aid did seem to influence Ukraine's willingness to discuss a ceasefire, at least in the short term.
Bremer outlined a potential deal Trump might seek with Putin. What did that involve?
Things like potentially ending sanctions, maybe joint investment in the Arctic, cooperation in the Middle East. But Bremer also noted Trump hasn't strongly condemned Putin's actions.
Which sends a message, right?
It does. Pursuing a deal is one thing, but the lack of clear condemnation for the aggression could look like weakness or maybe even quiet approval.
There was some disagreement in the discussion about leverage, wasn't there? Is stopping Russian oil and gas the only big lever?
Bremer suggested other options exist. More support for Ukraine, sanctions on the Russian central bank, maybe energy sanctions depending on the oil price. His point was that leverage isn't static, it depends on the context.
Right.
He also highlighted that disconnect sometimes between Trump's public rhetoric on Russia and what his advisors might think.
Interesting. Okay, lastly, the Israel-Gaza conflict. Bremer started on a somewhat positive note regarding Trump's Iran policy.
Yeah, he suggested that taking a firm stance initially could actually lead to direct talks later. He used the Houthi situation as a kind of example. The idea being strength can create an opening for diplomacy.
And he also mentioned Trump seemed pretty tough with Netanyahu in a recent meeting.
Apparently so. Talk of potential tariffs, questions about U.S. aid, the relationship with Erdogan, Iran talks, maybe limiting Israeli military action against Iran.
So not just unconditional support, challenging the narrative a bit.
Right. Showing a willingness to push allies if U.S. interests are seen differently.
But Bremer was also quite critical of the overall U.S. position on Gaza itself, wasn't he?
Very much so. He pointed to the loss of global support, the perception of the U.S. backing the occupation, cutting off humanitarian aid, and he raised serious concerns about reports of deporting green card holders for criticizing U.S. policy.
Framing that as a free speech issue.
Absolutely. He stressed this tension between supporting an ally and upholding core American values, free speech, humanitarian concerns. He felt leaders need to consistently uphold those values.
There was a thoughtful bit there about balancing free speech with protecting national culture, especially regarding non-citizens.
Right, a complex issue.
But he ultimately came down hard on due process being a fundamental American value for everyone within U.S. borders.
Yeah, his closing thought really emphasized that America's strength isn't just military or economic. It's tied to those core principles of liberty and justice.
So wrapping up this deep dive, Ian Bremer's analysis really paints a picture of complexity, doesn't it? Lots of contradictions in current U.S. policy.
Definitely. Tensions between trade goals, alliance management, domestic values, new tech like AI.
Yeah.
It's a lot interacting.
And it creates this climate of real uncertainty with potentially very long-lasting consequences.
Yeah, what's fascinating is tracking how all these pieces influence each other, the intended consequences, and maybe the unintended ones too.
Which leaves us with a big question to think about, doesn't it?
Well,
with AI changing things so fast and the global map shifting, how does the U.S. balance its own needs at home with its role in the world and the need for strong alliances?
or maybe.
Yeah.
Is that whole traditional idea of alliances and global leadership changing fundamentally, becoming obsolete in some ways?
That's definitely something to mull over, a provocative thought to end on.
Indeed. The answers aren't simple, and they'll shape a lot of what comes next globally.
Absolutely. We really hope listeners reflect on these insights, maybe dig deeper themselves. If you want more from Ian Bremmer, his website is g0media.com.
And he's active on social media too, at Ian Bremmer, worth following for ongoing analysis.
Yeah, engaging with these complex topics, forming your own informed views, it's crucial as the world keeps, well, evolving so rapidly.
Couldn't agree more. Staying informed, thinking critically, never been more important.
Agreed. Well, thanks for taking this deep dive with us today.